is based on a paper that I wrote with Naomi Lamoreaux, who is now an emeritus professor at the law school at Michigan. And we were asked to participate in a conference on can democracy and capitalism be reconciled? And the perception was sort of, oh, no, they're different things. And so the paper we wrote is called Capitalism, Democracy, and Equality, the Importance of Impersonal Rules. And so I'm going to talk about the argument there. I will also talk about the book that I am currently trying to finish, Leviathan Denied, which I talked about to some people this morning. When Naomi and I we were asked to participate in this conference, we were kind of like, well, yeah, obviously capitalism and democracy can coexist because they do coexist. And so if you're an economic historian and you're interested in economic development, particularly, I started out as an American economic historian. And you can ask this kind of question, well, why is the West rich? Well, the West is rich because they're all capitalisms and they're all democracies, right? And that's a no-brainer. And we can say, oh, well, capitalism is good or bad, democracy is good or bad. There's a bunch of definitions of them that we need to think about. But what I want to do today is kind of draw the simple empirical facts about whether democracy and capitalism are connected. And the answer to that question is no or yes. And the answer to the question is they are connected. But the question, I'm not even reading my own questions here, am I? Does the connection between democracy and capitalism exist at all levels of economic development and political development? And the answer is no, it doesn't exist at all levels. So when does this strong connection between advanced capitalism and advanced democracies appear? And why does it appear? Okay. And so I'm going to talk today about the appearance of advanced capitalism and democracy in the United States. In the paper, we also talk about the appearance in Great Britain in the 19th century and its failure to appear in Germany at the end of the 19th century. Even though Germany was a nascent democracy, they had universal male suffrage, they were growing economically. As we know, after the Weimar Republic is established in 1919, 20 years later, we have Hitler in World War II. Okay, so I'm not going to talk so much about what happened in Germany. What I'm trying to say is that there's something going on in America in the 19th century. I'm supposed to stand here, so I stay on the Zoom, not be over there. It enabled capitalism, advanced capitalism, and advanced democracy to appear in the United States. And that's really an institutional story. It's a story about changing the rules. It wasn't just it wasn't something in the water. It wasn't something in the air. It wasn't something about being American that did it, because it appeared in a bunch of different places. So what I want to do is to talk about why it's only advanced capitalism and only advanced democracies, which I'll define in a few moments, that has the close connection. That once we get outside of the richest 25 countries in the world, the connection breaks down. And there's essentially no connection between democracy and capitalism, where we define democracy as places that have elections, even if they're free and fair elections, and capitalism as a system in which people are free to use their resources however they want within an existing set of rules. Capitalism is not no government. Capitalism is, if I want to use my capital, if I want to use my labor, if I want to use my resources, I'm free to do it in an agreed upon set of ways. And as I'll talk about, the same rules apply to everybody. Those things only happen in about 20 countries or 25 countries. In the rest of the world, that relationship between capitalism and democracy just doesn't exist. The real cost of people in the rest of the world, people may not like capitalism. There's a long Marxian legacy of capitalists. Capitalists are the people at the top of the heap and they run the system for their own benefit. We live in a world where sometimes that's one of the views and sometimes that's not the view. It goes back and forth. But we want to talk about why that happens, how you get a capitalist economic system where people are free to use their resources. And then how do you get a political system that sustains that? For people to be able to be free to use their resources however they want, the rules have to allow them to do it. Okay? for Putin and the Olympics in Russia, the only guys who got to build stadiums were the oligarchs, were Putin's friends. If your system is set up so if you're not on the inside, you don't get to do stuff. You're not a capitalist society. There may be rich people, there may be elites, but capitalism is not about the presence of people who are pursuing profits. It's about the freedom and the liberty to pursue whatever you think is in your best interest. Okay? So it turns out that in order to understand how that comes about, we need to think about politics, because the government has to decide to pass rules and legislation that treat everybody the same. If different ethnic groups or different religious groups or different geographic groups can do some things that other groups can't, then not everybody is free to use their resources the way they want, and you don't have a capitalist society. So how did what we'll call a consolidated party system emerge? How did the political system that was able to sustain the political conditions for capitalism to exist, how did that come about? And so we're going to talk a lot about, I'll talk as I get to the end about party systems, and I just put some names. Chat, E. Shattenstein, Giovanni Sartori, Peter Mary, Alan Ware, Lipset, and Rokan. There's a huge literature out there about parties and party systems. So we know a lot about that, but we haven't connected it up to why those make capitalism work. And that's kind of what I'm going to try to get at today. Nope, I'm not going to press the right button. I won't. Okay, so I'm going to define capitalism as a system where people are free to use their land, labor, capital, and resources in the ways that they see fit. Okay, doesn't mean there's no laws. There's lots of laws. There's lots of rules, because they have freedom within the rules. The crucial element there is that the same rules apply to everybody. If the rules apply differently to different people, then you don't have a capitalist system. In advanced capitalism, the government provides these stable and unbiased rules that enable people to exchange confidently, and particularly important to form organizations whenever they want. So if you want to form an organization in Colorado, you go to the Attorney General's office, you fill out some forms, you sign some papers, and bingo, you're a corporation. State I lived in Maryland until the 1850s. If you wanted to form a corporate charter, you had to get an act of the state legislature. You had to get a majority of people in the state to approve your charter before you could become a corporation. And that was a real change in the structure of the political system. I'm going to define an electoral democracy as a system that uses elections to select their leaders. That's a kind of real basic one. A liberal democracy is one in which elections are free and open. Voters are not coerced. They're free to vote in secret if they want, and political parties are free to form. And an advanced democracy, which we want to talk about, is one where citizens enjoy a full set of political and civil rights, including the right to form organizations like political parties. But political parties themselves become durable and long-lasting, and the government follows the rules it adopts. So in the United States, this political parties become durable and long-lasting doesn't happen until the 1880s. When the Democrat and Republican parties become the two dominant parties. In the United States, anybody can form a political party. You just have to get a minimum number of votes to get on the ballot. But only two parties have won elections at the national level since the Civil War. Teddy Roosevelt came close. And most state parties are oriented around that. Not all of them. There's the Democratic Farm League in Minnesota, some places like that. But basically, we have a two-party system. In Europe, they have durable political parties, but they do not necessarily have two parties. If they have a proportional voting system, they might have 4 parties or 5 parties or 6 parties. But their parties are durable. The small number of parties that are major parties compete in elections, and they believe that they'll be able to compete in the next election. So that when a party loses, it doesn't disappear. In a factional system where there's lots of parties and lots of small groups competing to win control of the government, like in the last election, Brazil had something like 30 parties. And now in the next election, Brazil's going to have a lot of parties, but many of them will not be the parties that were around for the previous election. They'll be disappeared. Sometimes they'll be disappeared because they're violently eliminated. And those factional systems are not part of advanced democracy. So where did these durable parties come from? They weren't in America in 1800. They weren't in America in 1850. What happened in 1861? The Civil War. How many candidates ran in 1860? 4, right? We did not have a consolidated political system, party system. So the central problem in political economy, the kind of stuff I do, is who controls the government, and do they adopt rules that are good rules and follow them themselves? So we need a historical and conceptual framework that explains why governments do the good things and not the bad things. So I'm going to sketch this out in kind of a way that explains why impersonal rules that treat everybody the same can lead to positive economic growth, and why impersonal rules lead to consolidated political systems. Okay, why we move from a factional to a consolidated political party system, the two-party system, if you will, in the United States, that is actually able, and it is in their interest to maintain rules that treat everybody the same. It's not enough to say rules that treat everybody the same are good if you can't figure out how to get a political system that will actually create rules that treat everybody the same. So that's where we're going. In the mid-19th century, in about a dozen European countries, and I'll put a list up in the next slide, they began to adopt democratic systems that used elections. There were very few societies before 1800 that used elections. We did in the colonial period. Britain had some, only about 5% of the population could vote in the British systems. Most other places in Europe did not. Some of the countries adopted impersonal rules that treat everybody the same. In America, we call those general laws. And advanced capitalist systems only appeared in the systems that adopted impersonal rules. The systems that adopted democracy, elections, that did not adopt impersonal rules, advanced democracies did not appear. Okay, so here's the countries. I got to stand in the same place. Right? United States, United Kingdom, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Switzerland. Right? They adopted impersonal rules. They adopted democracies. By 1920, it was possible to form a corporation in any of those countries by just filling out a registration form. Belgium and France, they're kind of a little bit goofy on that. Germany, Austria, Italy, Spain, Portugal. Germany had universal male suffrage in their constitution in 1879 for the lower house. Anybody could vote. They had a general incorporation. Anybody could form a corporation. Turned out they really didn't have so much open access to personal rules because they formed cartels, so the existing firms were able to keep other firms out. And Germany, Austria, Italy, Spain, Portugal, even after Germany writing a new constitution, the Weimar Constitution in 1919, all of these countries lost their democracies in the 1920s and 1930s. Right? So in some sense, the breakdown of democracy in these places is why we have World War II. You don't have Japan up here. Same thing happened in Japan, although they were never quite so democratic before 1920. So this is kind of the groups that we want to explain. The political systems in all these countries were factional, meaning there were small groups of people that contended for control of the polity. In America, I've got a list here somewhere. By the middle of, this is from a guy named Jack Furness. By the middle of the 19th century, most legislative and executive officers in many states were chosen in competitive elections. So the United States, at the very beginning, elects people. At the same time, politics was becoming increasingly factionalized. Our textbook histories project our modern two-party system backwards into time, into the earlier period. The parties of the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans in 1800 or the Whigs and Democrats in 1840, were not the same as our parties of the Democrats and Republicans today. They were not durable, well-organized parties. They were groups of factions. So there were lots of factions that made up these elections. So in the second party system, which will eventually be the one with the Whigs and the Democrats, in New York alone, there were barn burners, hunkers, hard shells, soft shells, free soilers, young Americans, local focos, and so on. These were all parties, factions that ran candidates in statewide elections that the candidates won. So that when you look at that system, what's happening is that the rules that are being created in the legislatures are rules that are being created to benefit a particular faction. So the way this works, this is the book, Violence and Social Orders, that Taylor talked about. In most societies, the way you provide for stability is you create benefits for particular groups, particularly elites. And those agreements create what economists would call rents. And the groups only get to enjoy their privileges if they agree not to fight, if they agree to support the agreement. But those stable relationships only exist if the conditions may stay in place. When circumstances change, those things break down. In 1861, circumstances in the United States broke down and our factional system resulted in a civil war. Most political systems manipulate economic rents, economic privileges in order to provide for stability. And those systems, as a result, are not capitalists. List. We have a little more water there. Okay.
That happened because we're a new country.
Pardon?
That happened because we're a new country.
Well, no, but all the other new countries in the world at that time, most of them didn't do this.
But they're older, more scap, you know.
Well, not in Latin America. I mean, newness matters, right? But that's America's. Let me come back to that, okay?
We'll have time for questions at the end.
Yeah. So in a factional political system, factions can't expect to be in power for very long. There's just too many of them. So what happens is they're continuously jockeying for position, and they're producing economic outcomes that benefit one group versus another group. And I'll show you some examples of this in just a minute. So building political coalitions is a really risky business. Trying to build a coalition that lasts doesn't work very well. So what happens is a political party that wins an election today doesn't think that they're going to be in power tomorrow. So in the process of getting modern developed capitalist democracies, you get a set of changes in which they adopt impersonal rules. The legislatures agree to pass rules that treat everybody the same. They stop manipulating the economy for political purposes to create these privileges that tie the coalition together. And the parties transform from factional to consolidated. The Democrats and Republicans are around, they last for a really long time. The parties in the United States did not last for a really long time until the 1880s. And they didn't in Europe either. So consolidated political systems, our advanced democracies, are characteristic of the developed world, and they're not characteristic of political systems anywhere else in the world. They're not characteristic of systems in Latin America and Africa and Asia. So if we look here in this table, this is taken from Angus Madison's data. And we look at all the countries in the world that we have data for in 1910, 1940, 1990, and 2008. The world average of per capita income is $2,400 in 1910, $8,000 in 2008. And here's the 16 countries that we had in that list. The top panel of them, actually all of them, because we're going to include Germany and Spain and Portugal in that. It goes from 3,600 to 24,158. The ratio of income in the rich world, the capital and democracy world, goes from 1.5 times the world average to 3 times the world average. So that's what happens in the 20th century. The developed world takes off. It takes off in the places that are both capitalistic and democratic. It doesn't take off in the places that are neither capitalist or democratic. So the question of can capitalism and democracy coexist is yes, but not everywhere. It's not an automatic coexistence. So this table shows the correlation. I'm going to skip this table because I'm taking too much time. Let me go back here. Wait. Okay. AJ, I screwed up. When I gave you those, I deleted the slide that I wanted to have. So let's go back to these correlations just real quickly. A correlation coefficient is a measure. It's between 0 and 1 of how two things are associated with one another, right? So we take the whole sample of countries. The correlation coefficient is 0.56. And it's virtually certain that that's a relationship that's real. If we look at the top 25 countries, the relationship between democracy is measured by the polity score and their income is much weaker, 0.27. But that's because the democracies all have high polity scores of +10. If we look at the relationship between the bottom 70, between the quality of their democracy and their income level, there's no correlation at all. So what happens is when we start with the really rich countries, there's some correlation. As we add more and more and more poor countries, we get a stronger and stronger correlation between capitalism, between income and democracy. But it's a relationship that only exists in the rich countries, not in the poor countries. And I erased my figure that had that on there. Well, we'll forget about that. But there is no correlation between the quality of democracy and income for 3/4 of the world's countries. It's only at the top that that correlation exists. Now, why don't democracies get better? This measure is the polity score. -10 is total autocracy, +10 is the best democracies there are. 0 is halfway in between. Instability between factions, right, civil wars, is much more likely to occur at 0 than -10. The most unstable polities in the world, political systems in the world, are places that are neither democracies or autocracies. So if you want to transition to democracy, which is this light blue line, you got to move from the bad governments to the good government side. And the most dangerous place you're going to be is when you're neither a democracy or an autocracy. So as we go to the developing world and we encourage people to democratize, we actually make them more unstable. What happened to the United States when it was a factional polity? A civil war, right? We were unable to balance off the competing interests of the South and the North. Now, part of that was due to slavery, obviously, but part of it was due to the fact that we didn't have a political system that could keep everybody on the same page.
Could you explain this graph a little bit more because it?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Bye. This series 1 is instability. Series.
But you have many points along that x-axis.
I'll tell you what. Series 2 is an armed conflict occurs in your country.
I can read those. Tell me.
I get you. I'm trying to help. Just give me a minute, okay? So that's the squares. But what's the probability that your country will have an armed conflict within it, a civil war, given that this is your polity score? So if you're an autocracy, Saddam Hussein, right, it's pretty low. It's about 0.2%. Okay? 0.02. Not 2%. As we get to here at -3, which means you have some democratic institute, you might have some elections, you might have representatives. The probability that you'll have armed conflict goes up. To when you get to 0, it's almost 5%. So that means in countries that are in this range, once out of every 20 years, they have a civil war. This one, series 3, is a regime change. That means there's a change in the government that's not due to an election. It's due to a coup or some kind of takeover. Number one, the instability is the sum of 2 and 3. Okay? So it peaks at about 10%. At 0. Those are the most unstable places in the world. Okay? Yeah, no, you were absolutely right to ask me about that. And I have a version, never mind. I can't explain why I have a crummy graph, but I do. In the published version, it will be much clearer. Okay? So the key here is that as you start to move to become more democratic, you make yourself more unstable. Why is that? Well, you got all these factions and you introduce elections. When you introduce elections into a factional system, one party wins, the other parties lose, right? What do the losers do? Let's blow the thing up. Sorry, that was a good question. And this is really a problem for the developing world. Most countries in the developing world are, we go back here. The average polity score for the bottom 70 countries is 0. Okay? The average country in the bottom half of the income distribution is at 0. They are at the most unstable point with respect to democracy and autocracy. They don't have capitalist economic systems, and they don't have democratic political systems. And they're highly unstable. So getting people to hear, countries to hear, produces both capitalism and democracy. They are related to one another. But the really stable places are only at the top, not at the bottom. It isn't like if we get a little more democracy, we get more stability. If we get a little more democracy, we get economic development. Now, that's really important to grasp because we in America tend to think, well, why don't they have democracy? We have democracy and we're rich. If they had democracy, they'd be rich too. So what does the World Bank and the development agencies and do when they go? What did we do? We invade Iraq. What's the first thing we impose? Democracy. Martial law. Well, we did that too. Well, we got elections. What did we do when we invaded Afghanistan? Elections. Okay. Does it work? No, moving them from here to here makes them less stable, not more stable. All right. So in the US, shifting to impersonal rules happened in the state constitutions, not the national constitution. The national constitution has no provision that says all the laws have to treat everybody the same, but almost all the state constitutions do. Oh, I got a step here. Hi. Okay. So what I want to do is just show what the state constitutions did, how the reforms came about, and why they created particular political problems, and why they moved America towards capitalism and democracy. My friend Naomi and I have been gathering state legislative records and constitutions before 1850. 75% of all the laws in a typical state applied to specific individuals, specific organizations, or specific localities, towns. In the argot of the time, these were called private, special, and local laws. Okay, so 3/4 of all the legislation passed by a state legislature was one of these 3 things. So here's my favorite. It's granting the right to David Baker of Cass County to get a divorce from his wife without having to follow the rules. Okay. Here's one that gives William C. Richardson, Andrew Johnson, James Chapel Rue, Ashbel Tuttle, Francis Murphy, Charles Lyon, and A.B. Knowlton the right to form a corporation. Nobody else, just those guys. Here's one that allows this list of names to form a voluntary organization. Again, it gets to be a corporation, an organization that exists, that can own property, that can sue and be sued. It's for a specific group of people. Here is a law that allows a particular county, Pulaski County in Indiana, to borrow money. One county gets singled out. Now, what do the legislatures from Pulaski County do in the legislature? They're trading off these bills and these privileges with people from other counties. Here's a bill to increase the pay of a particular judge. In this case, in Harrison County. Indiana in 1851 passed what we could call the first general law provision. And it said, the General Assembly shall not pass local or special laws in any of the following enumerated cases. And then there's 17 things for which they cannot pass private, special, or local laws. They must pass a law that applies equally to everybody. Included is divorces, changing your name, all kinds of stuff. Second clause, in all cases enumerated in the previous section, and in all other cases where a general law can be made applicable, all laws shall be general and of uniform operation throughout the state. That's the general law provision. Whenever possible, the legislature has to pass a law that applies equally to everybody. Now, equally to everybody in 1851 meant white males, not women, not blacks, okay? But it applied to a big chunk of the population. The laws had to apply to people equally, and finally, corporations shall not be created by special law, but may be formed under general laws, laws that allow people to put down their money, sign the form, and become a corporation, become a privileged corporation. Okay. Here's what happened to the laws in Indiana. The Constitution was in 1851. In 1850, the Indiana legislature passed 550 laws. 50% of them were private laws. Only 8% were general laws. So 90% of the rules were laws that applied to specific people, specific organizations, or specific towns. In 1855, they only passed 114 laws. And this legislature was biennial. It was 2 years rather than just 1 year. So they passed 10% fewer laws, and 65% of the laws were general laws, laws that applied equally to everybody. Huge change in the way the laws were written. You could be a PhD in American history and not know this. We don't teach it. Obviously, something in the political system changed when these general law provisions went into place. Here's the number of pages in the what are called the session laws of Indiana that every state legislature has to print all the laws that were passed. We just counted the pages. Here's what happens in Indiana when that general law provision goes in. Here's the years that they passed general law provisions and banned special charters, banned special laws to create a corporation. As you can see, they're all, with the exception of Florida, and of course, Florida is still weird today. They either passed them at the same time, and most of the laws up to the far right, that's when they became a state. That was when they were entering. Or up here in this quadrant, which meant they created a general law provision and then later banned, they banned special charters and then later on created a general law provision. By the time we get to 1900, almost all the states have general law provisions. Almost all the laws passed by state legislatures are meant to apply equally to everybody. Here's what happens in Illinois when they passed their provision in 1869. Here's what happens in Pennsylvania when they passed their provision in 1873. Massachusetts never passes a provision. And that's what happens to the number of laws in Massachusetts. They just keep passing special private and local laws. So basically what happens in American history is that we get the Constitution in every single state by 1780. Every state has a constitution. And then we get the Articles of Confederation ratified in 1781. The Articles of Confederation get replaced by the National Constitution in 1789. That Constitution does not require general laws. None of the state constitutions require general laws. They all use elections to select leaders. That's why we think of them as being democratic, right? But all of them create factional democracies that produce lots of laws that name specific individuals, specific organizations, specific towns. Since the laws that are being produced create privileges for individuals, can those really be capitalist societies? Are you free to use your resources however you want? Well, not unless you have the right law that applies to you. Joe gets a law for him, and Eric can't do something because of it. Now, if we always think of the laws as applying equally to everybody, then this just doesn't exist. But it existed. It was the history that we had. And it was equally true of the history of all those other countries on those lists. They all had factional democracies. They all had systems where the laws treated specific individuals differently from each other. And that was the way to provide for stability, right? Because the privileged people who got their own laws didn't want to fight and upset the apple cart because they would lose their privileges. But if circumstances changed and those privileges were no longer as valuable, the whole system could fall apart. And that's what happened in 1860 and 61 after the election of Lincoln. The Southern faction figured, hey, we're going to get screwed. So let's leave now. And we don't think of the United States as being susceptible to civil wars, except we had a huge one. Now remember, and thank you for asking me to do this. Moving into this range means the probability of civil war goes way up. And the problem of a coup goes way up. So societies often stay down here because they don't want to go through this really dangerous space. The strong man comes in, I'll provide order. Okay? Now, we know that the places with the strong men don't have good economies and they don't have democracy. So we say, let's make them more democratic. But when we make them more democratic, we randomize the selection of leaders, we get more factions, we get more broken pieces, and we get more negative outcomes. What happened in the 1830s is there was a gigantic crash in the economy. The Panic of 1837 is the way we usually describe this. There's more stuff going on. 8 states in the territory of Florida default on their debts. That is, they stop making interest payments. And some of the states just repudiate their debts. Michigan repudiates half their debts. They never pay them back. Arkansas, Florida, Mississippi, and Louisiana never pay the money back. Okay, can you imagine that happening today? Well, maybe if Ted Cruz is in charge, we might, but right, because he was advocating that we not lift the debt restriction, so we would default on our debts, we would miss interest payments. Really, really expensive. Naomi and I have written several papers about how this crisis, and the worst state affected was Indiana, responded by saying, we got in trouble because we're paying too much attention to local issues and not enough attention to the picture that's happening in the whole state. Indiana borrowed to establish canals and railroads to all these different counties, and they built too many of them, they go bankrupt. So what they did in 1851 is they said, every law must apply equally to everybody, at least to all white men. And that changed the political dynamics of how Indiana made laws. So what this did, and I'm going to talk this is again, not a great slide. Too many bullets. What happened, and Eric has actually written about this, in the 1880s and 1870s and 1880s, the states began changing their election laws to provide for secret ballots, the Australian ballot, what were called anti-fusion laws. Not a candidate can only list under one party, not under two parties. And the idea was to get rid of third parties and consolidate the democratic process, but also to prevent people from watching and seeing who was voting and how they were voting. So if you wanted to bribe somebody, you wanted to make sure that they delivered. And if you could see them, you could be sure they get it. If it was a secret ballot, you couldn't. So you're changing the electoral rules. Most historians think of this as being anti-democratic because what it produced was two parties, Democrats and Republicans. And the 10-party system and the faction system went away. But what happened from the standpoint of the parties is that they now could believe if I lost the election this year, I could come back next year. Whereas in a factional system, that was never the case. So they changed the expectation of the political parties. Who in our system of government runs the government? You and me? Maybe some of you have been government officials. The political parties run the government, right? They nominate the officials run from political parties. They're part of an organization. They have an agenda, they have a platform, they do that stuff. Maybe they get into office and don't do it. Maybe they get into office and do something different. But the people who get to run the government are the people who were organized in political parties to win elections. Now, when they get into office, it's really difficult for them to manipulate the economy compared to how easy it was before, where they could pass a law for individuals. So the manipulation of the economy by the polity declines. Systems become more stable and parties become more long-lived. As the parties become more long-lived, they're able to make deals to make the economy, make investments in highways. And Taylor's written about the interstate highway system, and we get better infrastructure. Of course, we've been having some trouble with that, but the parties themselves have a longer time horizon because they're durable. In a factional system, they do not. Okay? So remember the Bambers, Hunkers, Hard Shows, Soft Shows, Free Soilers, Young Americans, Local Focus, and so on. What was happening in a factional system is that there would be 10 parties. And if you could pass a law that benefited Taylor, and he was in my constituency, I would pass a law that benefited Taylor, and I would deal off for a law that benefited somebody else in another district. And you would build a majority by passing all these private, special, and local bills. So you couldn't control the legislators because it was always possible for them to get what they wanted for their constituent by passing a private, special, or local bill. So the parties were not very stable. It was too easy. So what happened, and this happened in Pennsylvania in 1873, Naomi and I have written a paper about it. They passed a general law provision just like Indiana's. And they did it explicitly because Pennsylvania was a Republican state, and the Republicans usually won statewide elections, but they won 51-49. And they knew that when stuff came up for legislation, for a bill to pass, they could not count on all the Republicans voting together because the Republicans would vote with their other colleagues. Because 75% of the bills in Pennsylvania were private, special, and local bills. So they said, and I don't know if you've ever been to Philadelphia, there's something called the Union League Club. Big building. It was where all the powerful Republicans belonged. It was the Union League because they had supported the Union during the Civil War. And they presented a plan that they would pass a general law provision like Indiana's in order to save the Republican Party, to prevent it from being overtaken by the Democrats. And Naomi, is a wonderful historian, so this is all documented in all these quotes and things. And in fact, what happened was the Republican Party became the dominant party in Pennsylvania. I'm almost done. Okay. Now, the historians think this is anti-democratic because what did it do? It established the Republican Party. And there are laws like this, Eric has written about this, all around the country that provide for more stable political parties. What happens in Europe between 1880 and 1920 is you get changes in election laws that lead to more durable parties. They're only occurring in places that have impersonal rules. They're only occurring in places where the political system has disciplined itself and said, we're not going to have different laws for different people. When they do that, they change the nature of political competition in such a way that the political parties, like the Republicans in Pennsylvania, have a strong incentive to maintain impersonal rules. And the reason is, if you win an election, you get control of the government. What's to prevent you from using the rules to screw your opponents? Well, in the normal course of business, nothing. So in Brazil, when they have those 30 parties in one election, half of them are going to be gone by the next election. And what's going to happen right away is they're going to start passing bills that discriminate against opposition parties. That happens all over the world, outside of the democratic core. By agreeing to impersonal rule provisions, the political parties are agreeing with each other that when the other party gets in power, the rules they pass will apply equally to everyone. So the possibility of screwing a losing party goes way down because the ability to manipulate the economy through rules that treat different people differently has been taken away. All the other advanced capitalist economies went through a similar transformation. The ones that were advanced capitalisms and advanced democracies. They all moved to impersonal rules. The ones on that list, Germany, Italy, Spain, Austria, Portugal, never moved to impersonal rules. So even though they were democratic and had elections, their elections did not produce stability. They produced civil war. Now, we usually don't tell this story about America. And we don't tell this story about Britain, and we don't tell this story about Norway, and we don't tell this story about Sweden. We tell the story that they were democratic and they had elections. The guys that won the Nobel Prize, Ron Asimow, Simon Johnson, and Jim Robinson, they won it in November. And they say the reason economies grow is because they're inclusive. They include people. They have suffrage rights. Okay? The problem is that if you get a democracy that's inclusive and has free and fair elections, you're likely, if you don't have impersonal rules, to be in that central zone. How do you get to the point where you stop passing laws that discriminate against people? Democracy does not guarantee that. The places that have become rich are both democratic and capitalistic in the way I define them. So democracy and capitalism can exist, but only in the presence of impersonal rules. That's it. Sorry, I didn't think wildly get going there. I was slow out of the gate.
All right, so we're gonna take questions. I'm gonna moderate the questions. I would urge you to have a question mark at the end of a statement, because that's what a question is. And if it has a long preamble, get to the question mark part of your statement. But we'll start with the audience, and then I might take a few from the online people as they come in. But yeah, over here.
Thank you for the talk. You've presented empirical evidence to us of a coupling between democracy and capitalism.
Yep.
That graph that we talked about a lot.
Right.
So here's my question. What happens to the risk of political calamity under advanced capitalism? To the extent as we understand advanced capitalism, creating an inequality in society by separation of wealth, which would create a tension that would upset the political balance.
Right, that's a really great question. So our countries that aren't capitalistic more or less equal than capitalist countries.
Say that again.
Some of the advanced countries are more unequal than even the autocratic.
Not really.
At least they want you to.
You look at the statistics today, I think so.
Well, so what happens in America is you've gotten more unequal since the 1950s or 60s. What happened between the 20s and the 50s? We got more
We had
equal.
a war.
No, yeah, but we got more equal.
Yes,
Okay,
we had equal, fairly equal up until 1950, actually up until about 1980, and then it
yeah, started
started
growing,
to
right?
expand
So,
away.
so what's happened in American history is inequality goes like this. There's reasons it goes like that. Claudia Gold and Larry Katz have a book called The Race Between Technology and Education. When the payoff to a college education goes up relative to a high school education, or when the payoff to a high school education relative to an elementary school education goes up, inequality tends to widen. And when they narrow, inequality comes back down. What's Malinowski? The guy who writes about inequality. Branco. Oh, yeah. Mladenovich shows that there is a relationship between growth and inequality, but most of the time, inequality goes like this, not like this. Okay, so we associate inequality with rich people getting richer, and we associate that with capitalism, right? So if you go back in time, Bronco's done this with Jeff Williamson and Peter Linder. If you're in a really poor country, how unequal can the distribution of income become? Well, it can't get very unequal because if one guy gets a lot of stuff and everybody else is close to subsistence, right? They'll all starve. So what's the possibility for inequality in the United States?
If you use a Gini coefficient, we rank below if you rank the countries by Gini coefficients, we're very unequal. And the countries that are ahead of us are Brazil and other
Right.
countries that are very well known for being
Right.
autocratic or
Right.
having high.
Okay,
degrees
so
of-
we've had, I'm not disagreeing with we've become more unequal. Have we become more unequal because we're capitalists?
Could be because of laws.
Could be because of laws, and Thomas Piketty would say it's because we changed the tax laws. There's lots of different reasons, but the countries that are way ahead of us, like Brazil, are they countries that have open access laws that treat everybody the same? They have viable democracy, they have real competitive elections, but they don't treat everybody the same. You ever run an NBER jet? That's the Brazilian champion. So NBER gets to build jets because they get favorable treatment from the government. They don't treat all the airplane companies the same. Okay, so it's a really interesting question whether capitalism causes this, whether wars cause increasing equality. Walter Scheidel wrote a book called The Great Leveler, which argues that. But it's not at all clear that places become more unequal because they're capitalists. Okay. What happens is that countries that get richer can raise the income of everybody and become more unequal. And that's what's happened in the United States. Income at the bottom growth has slowed, although it was picking up for a while lately. It goes back and forth. So would you rather live in an equal society in which everybody is poor? Or a society that's unequal, but most people are middle income? Poor in relation to their outcome, but rich in comparison to the world. And that's kind of the problem we face. Right? There's absolutely, I'm not saying that inequality is not a problem. But the societies that decided to make the income distribution more equal by equalizing everybody's income through socialism didn't do so good. And the reason they didn't is because they weren't capitalistic at all. There was very little freedom to use your resources the way you wanted to within the rules. So that's.
Thank you. Question in the back.
So just to follow up on that, the driver of capital is profit motive, right? Profit motive is the driver. So couldn't we say that a more profit-oriented society that is therefore more capitalistic, if from a cultural perspective, might be more predisposed to write bad rules that would in fact preference certain people and not others? And that leads me to your own opinion. I'd like to know your own opinion about what's happening now. Do you feel like we're probably going towards autocracy? And then finally, it sounds like you're saying that it's better sometimes to leave a country from, the way it is instead of moving it towards democracy. But isn't that always a struggle? I mean, isn't there, or are you giving us an argument that you haven't stated about how do you do it incrementally?
No, I'm saying that why is there this big divergence in the connection between income and capitalism and democracy that's closely connected at the top, but not anywhere else? And the reason probably is that if you become a little bit more democratic, you become more unstable. And if you become more unstable, you don't grow. So that there is this murky middle region. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to make all the countries democratic. After World War II, there were maybe 20, not even 20, because we lost all the Axis countries. There were maybe 18 democracies in the world. They were all democracies that had impersonal rules. They were all consolidated. They all had consolidated political parties. So we started writing democracy. What is democracy in the context of those 18 countries? Subsequently, we allowed democracy spread throughout the world. Deliberately, we tried to do it. Did all the places that became democratic become rich? No, most of them didn't. In fact, becoming democratic does not raise your income on average if you're in the bottom half of the income distribution. And that's the point I'm trying to explain, that the association at the top really depends upon being both democratic and capitalist. Those two things have a synergy, but you need impersonal rules to make it work.
So Lionel Jospin, who was the president, Lionel Jospin was an economist who was the prime minister of France 15 years ago. He said that, market economy, yes, market society, no. So his critique seems to be here that you can have a culture that is so acquisitive and profit-oriented that it leads towards this inequality in which, the rules get written for certain people and you get less impersonal rules. You think we may be lapsing into that?
So I'm an economic historian, right? And believe me, the rules in our society are way more impersonal than the rules were anywhere in feudal Europe. We're in anywhere in the world before 1800.
I'm right this minute because of Trump and all of that.
Well, what Trump is doing is, what Trump is doing, and I'm scared and I don't like it. And I know that the national government does things, but we pretty much have impersonal rules in the United States. Does that mean everybody gets, all the laws treat everybody exactly the same? No, it doesn't. Okay. But on average, we do, right? When you go to get a driver's license in the United States, does anybody check to make sure you're a Republican or a Democrat? No, but in China, they do, right? In India, they had this great experiment where you had to pay people to get your driver's license. It'd be a train, and it didn't matter whether you got trained to drive or not. If you paid, you got your driver's license, and if you didn't pay, you didn't get your driver's license. Those kind of things are endemic in most societies. And the handful of societies that became advanced democracies and advanced capitalisms managed to put in a modicum of impersonal rules. Are all the rules impersonal? No, they're not. But so many of them are, that our daily life is conducted under a set of rules in which I don't care who you are. I know that you and I are going to subject to the same rules. So I can have a market economy where I don't have to know the identity of the person I'm buying groceries from.
Backslide.
But
How do advanced democracies and advanced capitalist societies, such as the United States now, are there examples of such that backslide?
well, so
Or
it depends on how you do. So this is the book I'm writing about the late 19th and early 20th century. So Germany doesn't backslide, but it's clearly growing rapidly in the late 19th century, but it's not an advanced democracy. And it's really not an advanced capitalism because people who want to are subject to limits because of the way the economy is set up. And so what happens, they lose World War I, they write a very democratic constitution under the Weimar Republic, but they keep factional. There's a wonderful book by Daniel Ziblatt, a political scientist at Harvard, called The Conservative Origins of Democracy. And Ziblatt documents that Germany has like 20 conservative parties in the 20s and 30s. So they're all competing for their pieces, right? So it's impossible for them to get durable party structures together. And as a result, when Hitler gets into power and the chancellor appoints him and he gets elected, but like he has 30% of the vote, then what does he do? He shuts down the whole system. Now, that's the Trump problem. Right? Are we going to shut down the rules? Are we going to start treating people differently? Oh, you're a Jew. Sorry, you're gone. Oh, you're a Pole. I'm sorry, you're gone. Oh, you're black. I'm sorry, you're gone.
We've heard the vice president recently say that it isn't necessarily the case that the rules of the adjudication by the courts will be followed because the courts don't have.
So I'm gonna, you've asked a question, so I want to move on to a different.
Like your comment on that question.
Yeah, you asked a question and then you want to come back around, we'll move on. Okay.
The key thing here, at least one of the key components, is consolidating
Yes.
political system.
Yes.
What do you say to the hypothesis that they're really not different at all, right? So a consolidated political system with two parties
Yep.
have all the factions
Yep.
within them as
Yep.
opposed to externally.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And the only thing that's different functionally is that the bargain takes place before
Yep.
in a consolidated system as opposed to a
Right.
factionalized system where the bargain has to be after the election.
Right.
And in fact, if I look at the Democratic Party that won with Clinton in 92,
Yep.
has no semblance to what the Democratic Party is in terms of the dominant factions, the ones that became extinct.
Right.
And by that same argument, an analog is Trump won.
Right.
Because he totally destroyed the
Yeah.
dominant factions in the Republican Party that had become discredited.
Right.
So do they really matter then?
Yeah. So what's
Why?
the difference
What's the difference? Yeah.
in personal rules?
Personal rules arose because of the consolidated party system.
Yeah. So what happens in America, and here the national government is a interesting case. The national constitution does not have a general law provision that says all laws must apply equally to everybody else. The states pretty much do. Okay, so the norm of behavior in the national government is laws are impersonal. Are all the laws impersonal? No, right? Even at the state, not all the laws are impersonal, but all the ones that can be are. And if that's the norm, then having factions within your party means the factions have to come together and coordinate to keep your majority together. Now, the Republican Party is breaking up. And you guys are asking me, an economic historian, to give you advice about the world you live in, which is not the smartest thing to do. What do I know that you don't know? I know some history, right? And the evidence is pretty clear that the places that get consolidated party systems have to have impersonal rules or they end up remaining fragmented in faction. So are there differences always? Yes, there are. The difference between a consolidated party system and a factional party system is a consolidated party system, you don't kill the losers when you win. In a factional system, sometimes you do. And that's the big difference. But that, I think, comes about because of the impersonal rule requirement.
Question back there.
So when you're looking at historical comparative statistical analysis, how do you address the impact that colonization has and information gaps related to colonization?
Well, so of that list of countries that I had, so here's the no impersonal rule places. How many of these are colonies?
Australia, Canada, New Zealand, US. I was thinking more about slide, I think it was around 14 where you had the table that talked about like the comparison between the countries you identified and the rest of the world. And I was
Yeah.
thinking about like the global south and how that might sway those statistics and if there's any information
Right,
gaps.
okay,
related to
so-
that.
So I think colonization is a really interesting phenomenon that we don't understand very well. Okay, so colonization by Brits worked great in the United States. Canada didn't work so good in the Caribbean. It was terrible in India, and that's how it created Africa. Being colonized by Belgium was probably the world's worst outcome. Okay, Okay? So colonization was a highly varied thing. I was in Delhi in January. This is like 20 years ago. And that's when their Independence Day is. I think January 26th or something like that. And we were in a cab driving around like we're in New Delhi where the government buildings are. And I said to the cab driver, you know, July 4th is our Independence Day. And he said, no, you were never a colony, Britain. And I said, well, yeah, we had, no, so I'd stop right there, right? But the idea that being a colony resulted in the bad outcomes, in some cases that's really true. In some cases it's really not so true. And I don't think we've gotten to the bottom of it yet. We live in a world in which the decolonization efforts that occurred at the end of the 20th century, right, post 1960, produced a lot of uncertainty and a lot of instability. And that hump-shaped graph applies to a lot of those places. So when did Latin America become decolonized? In the 1820s and 1830s, maybe a little bit later in Cuba, some places. But the 19th century colonization in Latin America occurred much, much earlier than the decolonization occurred in Africa. Now, who's richer today, Latin America or Africa? Latin America, by and large. Is Latin America like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia? No. But their political systems are neither as democratic or as capitalist. And so the impact of colonization really depends upon how the place that gets decolonized adapts. The United States did not move into a democratic capitalism in 1789, 1776. It didn't really do it until 1851 in the second half of the 19th century. And did the United States have an incredibly costly civil war? Yes. Did we get it right out of the box? No. And that's what the history teaches us. If we follow the right history. Yeah.
I'm gonna go over here.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. So you're clearly placing a lot of emphasis on impersonal rules, and that makes sense to me. I guess I'm still confused as to, I'm wondering whether we've just pushed the question back. So we say, well, impersonal rules arose in, those places. Why those places? And
want me to
why
write
when
another
they
book?
did? I would
Okay.
love that. Yeah.
I can't answer that question concisely,
Uh-huh.
okay? I can't tell you, I know that the reason Indiana adopted its general law provision in 1851 is completely different than why Pennsylvania adopted it in 1873. Pennsylvania is learning from Indiana, and that's one of the reasons they did it. But they did it for reasons that we would think were increasing inequality and solidifying the elites of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania. Okay, so the reasons that they did these things are not correlated with the outcomes. It turns out that when you adopt an impersonal rule, you got better outcomes, but not because that's what you were intending to do. It's just that you change the dynamics of how the political pieces work. I think Murat's absolutely right that there's still lots of factions and different interests, but in consolidated systems, they're forced to work together in ways that they are not in factional systems. So those factional systems are much more likely to blow up. Okay, but is that why they're adopting the rules? Probably not. So I know that they do stuff in Scandinavia. I can document when they do things in different places, but documenting why they did it turns out to be a really difficult problem. And there's not a dead solid historical reason. So I can't come here and say, this is why they did it and this was their intention. The early movers all did it for a variety of reasons that were probably different. And what was happening is institutionally, structurally, they pricked into the right outcome. And once they got into that outcome, it was very stable. That's what I talked about this morning. I didn't talk today about that.
So I want to encourage the students in the audience to put their thinking caps on and come up with some questions. And so that has borne fruit over here. So yeah.
So in your hump curve, are there any countries which are around the middle of the hump curve which also have impersonal rules?
No.
No, there are none.
I don't think so. Here's what happens. When you look at the developed world, you see these societies in which basically the perception is the rules apply equally to everybody. And then you go to the developing world, poorer countries, and the presumption is the laws apply equally to everybody, but the reality is they don't. Okay, and so, as you get more deeply attentive to those countries, you find they really don't apply equally to everybody. Okay, and so even though the laws in form may say these laws apply equally to everybody, in reality they don't, and that's really the problem. Now, I wrote this book with Naomi Weingast in 2009, and we have not had one person from a developing country come and say we have impersonal rules. And that became in that book, that's what makes these open access societies, the developed world, that's what makes them developed. Although we didn't explain why it worked, we just said that's what's working, that's the common element. And nobody came forward to say, no, my country has impersonal rules.
So is your claim then that if every developing country decided overnight to adopt impersonal rules, they would be on the path to development?
No. If overnight every developing country decided to adopt impersonal rules, they'd probably all have civil wars in the next year. Because what's holding their system together is the fact that they have different rules for different people. It's identity rules, right? You have to have a rent, you're a powerful guy, you're a powerful person, so we have great privileges for you guys. And as a result, you don't fight. And all these other peons, forget about it. Okay? Because if you don't fight, we're all better off. But if you get pissed off because the price of your phone monopoly goes down and your profits go down and you decide you want a better deal and you start fighting, everybody in the room is worse off. Okay? And so that's the notion of elites and inequality is part of how societies maintain stability and limit violence. That's just the reality. Why developing countries are poor. They manipulate their economy to provide for political stability because the first order problem is avoiding civil war. They're not stupid. They can look and see, hey, there's the United States, there's Britain, there's France, this is how they do this. Let's adopt those rules. And if they adopt those rules, they're really worried that the next day or the next year, the relationships between the really powerful people are going to go south. And if they go south, things are bad.
So we have time for a couple more questions. So yeah, right here.
You may have just answered it, but your graph that we looked at is very unsymmetrical. It's much more unstable on the right than on the left, suggesting that having, I forget what word you use for the x-axis.
The polity. So the autocracies are pretty stable and the high democracies are pretty stable, but over here, there's a little more instability.
It's almost linear. It's like you can't, is that sort of the world of revolution?
Yeah. So part of the answer to the questions that are rising about Trump now are, can we backslide? Will this happen? And I don't know the answer to that. But let's face it, if America and Western Europe depended upon the quality of their leadership to maintain their wealth, we'd all be poor. So there's something about the rules that we adopt, the agreed upon rules, right, that enable us to come with better outcomes. And the fact that it's only happened in about 20 or 25 countries suggests that there's something about those rules that are really different. And what I'm trying to suggest to you is that the missing element is those impersonal rule provisions. It was really clear in America that they changed the constitutions. They don't do that in Britain. They don't do that in Norway. They don't do that in Denmark. But all the rules that they pass, like in America, are primarily impersonal rules. They came to an agreement within their process to do that. So it's not chance that they're doing it. They just didn't do it in the same way because we do so many things for constitutions that it's easy to see in the American case. And that's why, just popped into my mind and my friends' minds, oh, this is what's going on. And then we found that, hey, this pattern is a bigger pattern amongst these places.
Michelangelo.
So I'm a scholar of state and local politics in contemporary United States, because I'm on the other end of it. So I agree with your general argument that impersonal rules are good for development and democracy and all that. But I worry if maybe we do have two impersonal rules, and we haven't seen it before because we are in this moment in time. And I'm thinking of this very much in the context of one of the major problems with political science today is that we've noticed that politics have become very nationalized and things don't have carve-outs anymore. We don't have those identity-based rules anymore. And that maybe to an extent is bad, and I think you even discussed this in one of your answers where we aren't having those carves out for elites that might need them in order to keep the system stable. So do you think, in theory, there might actually be a situation where it's too impersonal and we need some carve-outs to place the elites?
It could be. Does our society have elites? Yes. Do we have inequality? Yes. Do the rules favor the elites? Yes. Is it better to be a white male than a black female? Yes. I'm sorry, black females. You know, I've been privileged all my life, right? And I continue to get privileges. Okay, so our system is not perfectly equal. And it's not the equality of the outcomes that matter. It's the fact that when we went to impersonal rules, we changed the dynamics of the politics. Okay, now if it's the case that having two impersonal rules means that some elites are going to go off the reservation, then we're too impersonal, and that's going to be a bad outcome. I don't think that's happened yet. Okay, maybe Trump will actually do it. Who knows? But and you're a political scientist, right?
Yeah.
And so there's some wonderful things about political scientists are always concerned about yesterday's problem, right? And so they.
That's fair enough.
Right, sure. So the third wave by Harvard Huntington, Samuel P. Huntington, he says, he's trying to explain democracy and why it works in this book. And he's trying to explain it in the 1990s when there's been these waves of democracy. And he says, you know, I've been around for a long time. He's probably in his 70s, written his book. He says, every time something happens, the political scientists change their theories. Right? So all these waves of democracies all have a different theory associated with them. And I think that that's really right, because you're living in the moment and you need to understand what's happening now. But I don't live in the moment. You know, I'm a crusty old historian, and I'm trying to look at this longer term pattern. So it could be that we don't know, you know, if we could get too impersonal. And when I started to talk about this, and I would say, we need impersonality. That's a good thing. And no, we don't. We need personal relationships. We need people who love each other and know each other. No, not for rules, for life, yes, but not for rules. Right here. Thanks.
I've been, since you mentioned this way earlier, I've been thinking about the Civil War.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the Civil War appropriately several times as being that major, it's an aberration or a challenge to us. And of course it is. You use the word factions, suggesting that the North was comprised of factions of commonality. Let me finish. In the South was comprised of factions of commonality to the extent that they came together to fight this extraordinary battle. Looking at today, as a historian, I think we're as disparate and as divided today as a policy as we were since post-Reconstruction America. Therefore, I ask, if we're still reliving parts of that, what are the major factions that you identify as constituting the two areas, which will test my thesis maybe that we're as divided and in danger of repeating some of the things we did, maybe never since post-Reconstruction America?
That's a really good question. And I think one of the things that's really changed is the fact that instead of having a system where we had two very different systems of law that were identity-based, literally racially identity-based, right? And we wanted to keep those two factions together with different rules. That was going to be really hard. Because the faction that was being privileged in a particular way by owning slaves was like, we need to be guaranteed that we're going to continue to enjoy those privileges. And when they felt like those privileges were threatened, they left. And that's a very simple analysis of what happened in the Civil War. But I think we don't have yet, we have people who are upset, January 6th and the whole sort of bit. But basically, we still have a basic set of uniform rules that apply more or less equally to everybody. Colorado has different rules from Minnesota, different rules from Illinois. It's not that we have a universal common set of rules, but we have a political process which does not produce benefits for one section at the cost of others through the rules, in the rules. We have political policies which benefit one region as opposed to another, that benefit some demographic groups as opposed to another. You know, we're gonna reform Social Security, which is gonna hurt me. Okay. Hopefully if you're younger, you'll be better off, okay? So there are things like that, but those rules apply in a general kind of way to everybody. And that was not the situation that caused the Civil War.
All right. Did not cause the Civil War is a good way to end this lecture. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.